Granny Cornwall's Storytime. The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Graham. Chapter 4. Mr. Badger. Mole and Rat waited patiently for what seemed a very long time, stamping in the snow to keep their feet warm. At last they heard the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps approaching the door from inside. It seemed, as the Mole remarked to the Rat, like someone walking in carpet slippers that were too large for him and down at heel. Which was intelligent of Mole, because that was exactly what it was. There was a noise of a bolt shot back, and the door opened a few inches, enough to show a long snout and a pair of sleepy, blinking eyes. "Now, the very next time this happens," said a gruff and suspicious voice, "I shall be exceedingly angry. Who is it this time, disturbing people on such a night? Speak up!" "Oh, Badger," cried the Rat, "let us in, please. It's me, Rat, and my friend Mole, and we've lost our way in the snow." "What, Ratty, my dear little man," exclaimed Badger in quite a different voice. "Come along in, both of you at once. Why, you must be perished. Well, I never. Lost in the snow, and in the wildwood too, and at this time of night. But come in, you two." The two animals tumbled over each other in their eagerness to get inside, and heard the door shut behind them with great joy and relief. The Badger, who wore a long dressing gown and whose slippers were indeed very down at heel, carried a flat candlestick in his paw and had probably been on his way to bed when their summons sounded. He looked kindly down on them and patted both their heads. "This is not the sort of night for small animals to be out," he said paternally. "I'm afraid you've been up to some of your pranks again, Ratty. But come along, come into the kitchen. There's a first-rate fire there, and supper and everything." He shuffled on in front of them, carrying the light, and they followed him, nudging each other in an anticipating sort of way, down a long, gloomy, and tell the truth, decidedly shabby passage, into a sort of central hall, out of which they could dimly see other long tunnel-like passages branching, passages mysterious and without apparent end. But there were doors in the hall as well, stout, oaken, comfortable-looking doors, one of which Badger flung open, and at once they found themselves in all the glow and warmth of a large firelit kitchen. The floor was well-worn red brick, and on the wide hearth burnt a fire of logs, between two attractive chimney corners tucked away in the wall, well out of any suspicion of draught. A couple of high-backed settles facing each other on either side of the fire gave further sitting accommodations for the sociably disposed. In the middle of the room stood a long table of plain boards placed on trestles, with benches drawn each side. At one end of it, where an armchair stood pushed back, were the remains of a spread of Badger's plain but ample supper. Rows of spotless plates winked from the shelves of the dresser at the far end of the room, and from the rafters overhead hung hams, bundles of dried herbs, nets of onions, and baskets of eggs. The kindly Badger thrust them down on a settle to toast themselves at the fire, and bade them remove their wet coats and boots. Then he fetched them dressing gowns and slippers, and himself bathed the Mole's shin with warm water and mended the cut with sticking plaster, until the whole thing was as good as new, if not better. In the embracing light and warmth, warm and dry at last, with weary legs propped up in front of them, and a suggestive clink of plates being arranged on the table behind, it seemed to the storm-driven animals now in safe anchorage, that the cold and trackless wild wood was just left outside, was miles and miles away, and all that they had suffered in it a half-forgotten dream. When at last they were thoroughly toasted, the badger summoned them to the table where he'd been busy laying a repast. They had felt pretty hungry before, but when they actually saw at last the supper that was spread for them, really it seemed only a question of what they should attack first, because it was all so attractive, and whether the other things would wait for them until they had time to give them attention. Conversation was impossible for a long time, and when it was slowly resumed, it was that regrettable sort of conversation that results from talking with your mouth full. The badger did not mind that sort of thing at all, nor did he take any notice of elbows on the table or everybody speaking at once. As he did not go out into society himself, he had got an idea that these things belonged to the things that didn't really matter. He sat in his armchair at the head of the table and nodded gravely at intervals as the animals told their story, and he did not seem surprised or shocked at anything, and he never said, "I told you so," or "just what I always said," or remarked that they ought to have done so and so, or ought not to have done something else. The mole began to feel very friendly towards him. When supper was really finished at last, and each animal felt that his skin was now as tight it was decently safe, and by this time he didn't care a hang for anybody or anything, they gathered round the glowing embers of the great wood fire and thought how jolly it was to be sitting up so late and so independent and so full. And after they had chatted for a time about things in general, the badger said heartily, "Now then, tell us the news from your part of the world. How's old Toad going on?" "Oh, from bad to worse," said the rat gravely, while the mole, sitting up on a settle and basking in the firelight, his heels higher than his head, tried to look properly mournful. "Another smash-up only last week, and a bad one. You see, he will insist on driving himself, and he's hopelessly incapable. If he'd only employ a decent, steady, well-trained animal, pay him good wages, and leave everything to him, he'd get on all right. But no, he's convinced that he's a heaven-born driver, and nobody can teach him anything, and all the rest follows." "How many has he had?" inquired Badger gloomily. "Smashes or machines?" asked the rat. "Oh well, after all, it's the same thing with Toad. This is the 7th. As for the others, you know that coach house of his? Well, it's piled up, literally piled up to the roof, with fragments of motor cars, none of them bigger than your hat. He's been in hospital 3 times," put in the mole, "and as for the fines he's had to pay, it's simply awful to think of." "Yes, and that's part of the trouble," replied the rat. "Toad's rich, you all know, but he's not a millionaire. And he's a hopelessly bad driver, and quite regardless of law and order. Killed or ruined, it's got to be one of the two things, sooner or later. Badger, we're his friends. Oughtn't we to do something?" The badger went through a bit of hard thinking. "Now look here," he said at last rather severely. "Of course you know I can't do anything now." His 2 friends assented, quite understanding his point. No animal, according to the rules of animal etiquette, is ever expected to do anything strenuous or heroic, or even moderately active during the off-season of winter. All are sleepy, some actually asleep, all are weather-bound, more or less, all are resting from arduous days and nights during which every muscle in them has been severely tested and every energy kept at full stretch. Very well then, continued Badger, but when once the year has really turned and the nights are shorter, and halfway through them one rouses and feels fidgety and wanting to be up and doing something by sunrise, if not before, you know. Both animals nodded gravely. They knew. Well then, went on the Badger, we, that is you and me and our friend the Mole here, will take Toad seriously in hand. We'll stand no nonsense whatever. We'll bring him back to reason, by force if need be. We'll make him be a sensible toad. You're asleep, Rat. Not me, said the Rat, waking up with a jerk. He's been asleep 2 or 3 times since supper, said the Mole, laughing. He himself was feeling quite wakeful and even lively, though he didn't know why. The reason was, of course, that he, being naturally an underground animal by birth and breeding, the situation of Badger's house exactly suited him and made him feel at home, while the Rat, who slept every night in a bedroom the windows of which opened onto a breezy river, naturally felt the atmosphere still and oppressive. Well, it's time we were all in bed, said the Badger, getting up and fetching flat candlesticks. Come along, you two. I'll show you your quarters. And take your time tomorrow morning. Breakfast at any hour you please. He conducted the 2 animals to a long room that seemed half bedchamber and half loft. The Badger's winter stores, which indeed were visible everywhere, took up half the room. Piles of apples, turnips, potatoes, baskets full of nuts and jars of honey. But the 2 little white beds on the remainder of the floor looked soft and inviting, and the linen on them, though coarse, was clean and smelt beautifully of lavender. And the Mole and the Water Rat, shaking off their garments in some 30 seconds, tumbled in between the sheets in great joy and contentment. End of part 1 of chapter 4, Mr. Badger. To be continued.